Hello and welcome to another Renegade Economist talk show. This week I'm joined by Ian Mason, Barrister, Principal of the School of Economic Science and fresh back from addressing the UN on One World, One Wealth, Economics, Justice and the Rights of Nature. Ian, thanks for coming in. Busy man, so we appreciate your time. Tell us, One World, One Wealth. It's interesting that the UN are asking for this kind of opinion for that kind of audience. What did you talk to them about?
Well, the title One World, One Wealth was really intended to emphasise that there is a unity between the human race and everything that we depend upon and everything that we create out of it. And the subject, economics, justice and the rights of nature, is really about what the school has to teach about economics, which we do under the title of Economics with Justice. And the UN was interested in economics with an ethical dimension to it. And so that's why they invited me.
In 1903, famously, Cambridge University divorced the teaching of economics with the moral sciences, a seemingly innocuous act that has had huge ramifications.
Yes.
Talk a bit about this and how, from your point of view, actually those two things are inseparable.
I think the effect of the separation was that we changed the criteria by which we judge the success of economics. The modern basis for economic success or judging economic success is economic growth. And that means the growth in material production more than anything else, which of course has implications now for the whole planet from which we draw material production. It also has consequences for people because what we notice alongside it is great wealth on the one hand and great poverty on the other. And many people would describe that as unjust. If you introduce the idea of justice as a measure of the success of your economics, modern economics does not look so good for that reason, that it produces poverty, disease.
That's understatement so far. Yeah. Okay. A huge understatement, but yes, absolutely.
And so we say, actually, you can introduce justice as a measure of success, or at least the elimination of injustice. And if you do that, you start to rethink the whole of your economics. And that's really what we're calling for, a rethink of how economics is understood.
The beauty is the timing, insofar as the economics as the dismal science is in total disarray. People at Harvard are walking out of Greg Mankiw's lecture, for instance, because of his inability to explain properly the great financial crisis and the wider theory. What are the practical steps now that one can take, or you're taking, to start to float new ideas, and what are those new ideas?
Well, I suppose it starts with teaching courses and thinking the courses through, keeping them under constant revision, which is what we try to do. Because if you can't teach it, then it's not going to sort of get into the consciousness, and the understanding isn't going to change. So we offer courses, and we base them on the idea of justice in economics. And when you do that, you take really economics back to its most basic elements. The school has always really started from the view that economics is about a relationship. It's about relationships generally, but in particular, the relationship between the human race and the planet that we live on, or indeed the whole universe. But it's really, the planet is our immediate contact point. And when you start from there, you see where some errors have crept into economics, as, for example, confusing land and capital and treating them as though they're both the same, which they're not. If you isolate land and see it in relation to the human, you see how wealth is created out of that relationship. And you also see that it's a reciprocal relationship, and one which involves responsibilities for human beings.
When you use the word land, are you talking about a freehold under a property, an allotment, a field, or is that a broader definition?
When economists talk about land, although they don't usually recognise it or say it, they include the whole natural environment, everything that is provided by Mother Nature. Hence it's relevant to Mother Earth Day and the Harmony with Nature dialogue that was taking place at the UN. Land is actually the whole natural environment. And everything that lives and is dependent on as it were, what you would call the dry surface of the earth, is land. And if you confer ownership of it, you confer ownership of the whole natural environment.
When we start talking about private ownership, public ownership, we start immediately getting into this socialist capitalist debate. Just talk a bit about that, because it's a glib definition, these isms now, socialism, capital. Just talk a bit around this and about private ownership and the obligation that a private owner might have to a wider society.
The sort of left-right socialist capitalist divide is so 20th century. We need to move on, and we need to start to understand that economics can be understood as a unity. Economic laws are not socialist or capitalist. They're the way things work. And what we need to discover is the way things work. We need to move on from this sense of a left and a right and start to understand that the wholeness of economics as a holistic science, which is capable of describing how things work, how this relationship between the human and the natural world actually works, and what are the consequences of different ways of doing it. And when you start to look at private ownership of land and speak of it in terms of private ownership of the environment, you start to see the consequences of that. And one of the consequences, which is well documented in history and well known to geographers and other sciences, but somehow doesn't seem to have penetrated into the bastions of economics, is that it creates this huge division between the haves and the have-nots. Basically, the haves have some form of title to the natural world. The have-nots don't. And that creates a huge dependency. The have-nots are then utterly dependent on the owners. And it's particularly land, not just capital, but particularly land, that is exclusive.
What's your view on the 21st century land grab that's going on at the moment?
It's the product of the 20th century capitalist system. It is effectively privatizing land, and as you say, it's happening all over the world. Fred Pearson's book, The Land Grabbers, spells it out in detail, and it means that an awful lot of people will be dependent on relatively few people for everything they need to live. And that, in the end, is demeaning to the human spirit. It reduces people, and it makes some people very powerful and others powerless.
There are many people who'd listen to this and would think, the cynics, let's say, well, you're just a bit idealistic. It's not a view I take, but it's a view that we do hear a lot of. And we should be more pragmatists, we should be more pragmatic. What's your view on that?
I said to somebody the other day when it was very cold in London, and who came from Sweden, you must be used to this by now. And her response was, would you say that to a starving child? And I think the cynical view is, okay, so it's terrible, just get used to it. That's the pragmatic view, and I don't accept it. It's inhumane. Ideals have kept the human race going since it first began. And I think there is a place for holding human idealism high and saying, yes, we can actually do better. We do not have to accept the lowest common denominator as the only possibility.
I want to talk to you a bit about charity and this idea of handouts, and let me frame this. I interviewed the other day a famous businessman who will remain nameless, and he has two parts to his life. One of them is buying huge tracts of land in Brazil and shipping soya from there to China to feed pigs, because people are taking in more protein as they come out of poverty. The second element of his life, and that then comes with all the problems that you've depicted. The second element of his life are creating documentaries and films to address social justice. And I suggested to him that maybe one and the other are, cause and effect. And he said to me, yes, maybe, and brushed that aside. He's a pragmatist. Yeah. And he said, but I'd like to keep my commercial life and my personal life separate. Mm-hmm. Charity on the one hand, and this rampant land monopolist on the other. Right? How do you start to address that? Because that schizophrenia, if you like, is, at the moment, prolific, I would argue.
Yeah. Well, the title One World, One Wealth is intended to convey something holistic, which is, if you like, the opposite of schizophrenia. that you cannot actually keep one aspect of life separate from another. Another area in which we do this is in the difference between the way we treat our ordinary civil life and obligations and our economic life and obligations. We have a very clear system of rule of law to deal with our civil obligations in most civilized countries, with the result that you can walk down the street in relative safety, because people's so-called innate selfishness is not allowed to run rampant in the streets. But in economics, for some reason, we don't apply the same standard. We don't have the same sense of a rule of law, a sense of things that are done and are not done. And the result is the sort of economics which produces monopolies and concentrations of wealth at the expense of others. A holistic approach would recognize that actually the rule of law needs to apply to all of life, not just parts of it. And in the same way, it needs to apply to all of one's thinking, not just parts of it.
See, that's brand new, because you don't hear people talking like that. It's not brand new. It's a very old idea, but it's an idea that's being newly floated. How important do you think it's been for you to, because you're not a trained economist as such, in inverted commas, you're a barrister, you've come at this from a different angle. So you haven't been through the neoclassical economic teaching, you know, and drunk the Kool-Aid of the first year economics on a lot of these courses. What sort of advantage has that given you?
Well, it's not quite accurate, because I did actually do a basic first year course in economics.
But you survived, right?
Because I'd done some other economics first. I'd come across economics with justice, and that generated an interest. So when I did my law degree, I did some economic history and I did some economics as well. But I came to it from a slightly different perspective, and I think a more holistic perspective. And the other thing is that I came across people when I was a student and so on who took the view that economics should not be a sequestered subject that is kept in the halls of erudite universities. That is actually, it's something that concerns everybody, and that the basics of economics are simple, and that everybody is engaged in economics. Everybody who works, everybody who eats, everybody who breathes is engaged in economics, because economics affects these things and is affected by them. And so there was quite a strong drive to hold to the simplicities of economics, the basic things, and build economic understanding on that. And I found that helped. And it's been a great interest. And being a lawyer, one looks for laws, not just human laws, but the kind of lawfulness of whole situations.
Is that natural law?
I would call it natural law, yes. The law in the nature of
Yes, it
things,
does,
the laws of human nature.
But that then comes back to a philosophy. So, and when you start melding those two things, i.e. philosophy and economics, that's something that, again, hasn't been done for a fair bit of time. The Greeks tended to ask what is good, what is right, what is just. We seem to have lost that in our discourse, our political discourse, certainly.
Yeah.
Where from here? And just talk around that area of philosophy and economics.
Well, I think philosophy is basically the love of wisdom. And to be practical, one has to recognize that one does not start from wisdom. That wisdom is something that it is possible to grow towards through experience. So philosophy can be practical. And it's a matter of questioning your own life and the life you see around you, and asking what is best for the life of man, because we're human beings. And one sees that what is best for the life of human beings is actually what is best for the life of the planet as a whole. And that the sort of current tendency toward dominance of everything and the sense that we can manipulate everything is philosophically unsound, because the universe is bigger than we are.
Both economics and philosophy, the one thing they have in common is living the good life, or living well.
Yes.
And the wise promote living well.
Yes.
What we've had over the last, say, century, or certainly the last 50 years, let's just take Greenspan as an example. He's an Ayn Randian devotee.
Yes.
And the Rand idea is look after yourself at any cost, and everyone else will look after themselves. Yeah. No such thing as society, get on with it. Yeah. The neoliberal paradigm is in total disarray. He went and stood in front of Congress and said, I was shocked that, when he'd been carrying on for 40 years, and then suddenly, bash, this economic system, it comes off the rails. Is there a moment in history now where we start to think, well, maybe it's not all about us? I mean, we've been marketed too hard for the last 40, 50 years. Is there a moment now with this philosophy, or this philosophical idea and this economic idea, where we suddenly say, do you know what, there might be something bigger?
I think the moment actually occurred in the 1960s, when we first saw a photograph of planet Earth from outside. And I think there was a change in human consciousness when that was seen, the size of the planet. And what we're now seeing is the working out of that. And it's taken generations. I mean, 2 generations on, people are thinking in terms of the whole planet. And the sort of internet age and all the rest of it has unified people in a way that they've never been unified before. We can communicate, we can have common cause with people we've never met, know nothing about, from all parts of the world. And that is a change in consciousness, which is now working its way out. And it is showing up the sort of consensus of the last century or so, particularly in economics, for what it is, something which is deeply flawed. And therefore the questions are coming out, well, if it is that flawed, what do we do about it? How can we address it? But I think the moment, if you like, was that photograph of the planet as a whole.
It fills me full of hope, because you can, look at the current situation and think all is lost. That isn't your view, is it?
No, it isn't, no. Even as a race, human beings can look at the world around and respond to them. And there's a kind of feedback loop. And when you see things, when it's realized things are actually going wrong, people can respond to it. We are intelligent, rational beings, even though we don't always appear to be so. And in a way, collectively, we're wiser than we are individually.
At the Renegade Economist, collectively, our audience are far wiser than us individually. What are the 3 points that you'd leave us with? 3 action points, because we don't want to become a talking shop. What are the 3 things that young economists, householders, and let's say women who have had children and want to get re-involved in either the political process or the economic process, because we've found that they're our audiences. Yeah. What are the 3 things that or one of those action points for each of those groups?
Well, I think everybody who wants to talk about and understand economics should grow something, preferably food, personally, so that they actually understand the process and they understand the relationship between soil and plant and plate and stomach. Because really that's the centre of economics. So that would be the first thing. Just grow something, connect, even if it's just a pot plant. I think that would be the simple, most practical thing that anybody can do. And nobody should be allowed to qualify in economics unless they've done at least a year's horticulture, in my view.
Excellent.
And I think that's a very practical start.
Yes.
If you want to engage politically, I think that's not so easy until you've done some study. So have a look at economics in a more holistic way, and then see how it reflects in the political process. And engage with the political process, because it's very useful to get a sense of how it works and what the limitations on it are. And you can then, as well, lend support to those things which are heading in the direction of a more just economic system. And I suppose the third thing is to look to yourself and how do you live? How do I live? Does my life reflect natural laws? What do I need to do to live more naturally in a way which has less destructive impact on the planet around me?
Fantastic. Absolutely lastly, One of the regrets when we made Four Horsemen, the film, is there weren't enough female economists, leaders and politicians in it. And that wasn't through lack of trying. It's just that glass ceiling has been, in my view, has been there. For many reasons, not just the glass ceiling, but there have been many reasons why female leadership, we haven't seen enough of it. What's your view on that?
Again, we need to recognise that in everybody there is, as it were, the masculine and the feminine. And the masculine is that assertive, almost ambitious aspect. And the feminine in us is much more empathetic. And the sort of wisdom of empathy is an important feature of really understanding the world around us. Gaining a connection with it which is not merely intellectual, but is grounded in emotion and in love and in a different kind of understanding. And I think if the present age gave more emphasis to that, we would see far greater scope for the feminine, not just for women, but for the feminine. A rebalancing, if you like, and a deeper wisdom as a result.
Ian Mason, thank you very much for your time.